Hi, good morning, afternoon, whenever you're watching this. This is my talk about data issues in abusive language detection. And I'm Leon Daczynski, Associate Professor at the IT University of Copenhagen. So it's really hard to put all our data together. We have a lot of different definitions of abusive language. And different subtypes and subphenomena of abuse. And often the way we construct those definitions is really important because it's how we are able to annotate. But also those constructions aren't necessarily compatible with each other. And so often we'll call these annotations for hate speech or annotations of misogyny, for example. Whereas really those things we're annotating aren't necessarily compatible with other data sets from other researchers. At the same time, we see that our field's growing really rapidly. So I haven't done the count for this more recently, but we can see that we observed a massive growth over the late 2010s. And then afterwards, after, for example, the multilingual offensive hour exercises, this led to more data sets, and people have been fantastically digging into even more of the phenomena under abusive language and online harm. And that means more data. So we're getting a lot of training data sets out there, which you would think would be a fantastic thing. And I think in and of itself it is a very good thing. So I did a survey with, maybe you've seen it, a survey with Bertie at the Alan Turing Institute, and a number of people working there, helping categorize many of the different data sets we saw out there. We put a few criteria on what kind of data sets we'd consider. So, for example, the data had to be publicly available and downloadable. It's very difficult to measure things you can't observe, right? So in the end, this was reduced to 63 papers, and we were wondering, where are the gaps in the data that we're dealing with in abusive language? So looking at this, the first thing we can see is that, well, there's a very strong concentration of platform for the data, right? Twitter is extremely prevalent at the time, and I think that still holds to a certain degree for many languages. So we can say from this that our research and our models as well, therefore, are already quite tightly fit to Twitter, right? We're not getting a good grasp of how abuse really is if we only observe the interactions on one platform. And of course, the problem with this is that each platform has a different design, a different target user base, and a different audience. And the things like the design and audience will really affect how people interact. So if we're only able to observe abuse on Twitter, then maybe we'll miss it on other places. And vice versa. The different platforms have different norms. We'll get into that later. So what kind of things are we capturing, right? What kind of platforms are we looking at? Well, we're capturing tweets, we're capturing chat in computer games, we're having a look at a range of forums, and there's also a range of different audiences we're capturing, right? From private one-on-one conversations out to more public, undirected speech. There's also a range of contexts for which we have abusive language data. It can be ones where participants know each other and also where they don't know each other. And of course you can imagine these contexts have different norms where two very close friends might use an insulting term as a term of endearment, whereas this could very easily be interpreted differently to a broader audience. And it's very important to get that right. We can't just use the same metric and the same decision or judgment in terms of annotation on every utterer. There's also something of a range of natural languages, including German and Hindi and Greek and one other language. Here we go. I think maybe no surprise here. Of course, I have to realize I have my own bias here, and the study has its own bias. We did the searches in English. I'm a native speaker of English. This talk is also in English. So one would expect to find, or at least to have greater sensitivity to detecting English language data sets. And we can see here that we certainly have those, but I think probably to a much greater degree than one would find data sets in other languages. So for example, French online abuse isn't necessarily something we can say that we can model very well given this distribution of languages. Okay, so that's where the data is coming from. The next question we have, and I think this is the crucial question. This is possibly one of the biggest, if not the biggest, challenge of dealing with abusive language from a computational point of view, right? Which is how we represent abuse. So the first question would come in. One might think, is this offensive or not? And as you can imagine, this is a deeply problematic question, right? Because different people have different interpretations and different lines for what is offensive, and context is also very important, both social context and the kind of prior conversation we have there. I think, personally, I find the notion of something being objectively offensive not very useful, right? I mean, one can imagine a few things that could be objectively offensive, but this is not, and these often are the things captured by the legal definitions as well, right? But these aren't particularly useful. It's far too narrow. Maybe we can take, then in this case, a broader look at this and step back and take this hierarchical framing found in the OLID in Marco Zampieri's work, for example, the offensive eval shared evaluation task series, where we look at whether something is offensive or not given a certain definition, and then the type of target, right? Is this set against an individual or a group based on perhaps identity terms, or not targeted at all? And then if it is targeted, what is the kind of target? Are we talking about an organization, or are we talking about all people with a certain gender? And then also, so this, you can still see this is kind of broad, right? And we can represent some things like, for example, racism, where we have targeted insults towards a group based on an identity aspect, race, or based on gender, right? Then we can, maybe if the gender is female, then this could be a misogynistic text. But we find that, I think, beyond this level that you see in offensive eval, the different phenomena, the different kinds of offense there are, each have many different facets that are quite specific to that kind of abuse. Like in terms of misogyny, we could be looking at harassment, we could be looking at a threat of particular kinds of violence. It could be benevolent sexism, where someone simply has perhaps a stereotype that they're expressing. It could be malevolent sexism, right, where we have these, where one would have a very strong view about someone based on their gender. We could even be looking at this kind of neo-sexist attitudes, where we hold one gender to a higher requirement of proof or evidence about their status and lack of equity. There are other representations, kind of stepping back a little bit. If we're going to go and consider, for example, trolling as an online behavior, then there's the Gate Likert scale, which will measure different degrees of trolling. But you can. I think it's very easy to imagine that there's a wild world out there, right? And I think if we're going to talk about online abuse and offence, this captures way too many activities to be treated as a uniform classification task in a meaningful way. So maybe the negative things that have fed in a little bit to the rhetorical question we have here now, right? Are we doing it right? What problems have we addressed? Maybe I should cast a more positive light over this. So we do have all these data sets, right? And these are all created for a reason, the ones we looked at. In this case, to help address a social problem, right? I think if you're going to... this is, for example, a deep problem in a democracy. In many countries, we see decreasing or already very low rates of online participation due to the tone of the debate, right? So it's very common for the tone to become quite harsh. Causes of that may be echo chambers, maybe diminishing audiences, maybe a pre-existing harsh tone, right? And people won't like to be on the receiving end of this, so they avoid debate. So here we can maybe say we also have a fundamental problem with our democratic machinery if we can't have a good discussion that includes a decent amount of the population. And under COVID, when in Corona and lockdowns, right, that have come from that, this means even more and more online participation So if you don't get to do online participation, or if you think it's not going to work out very well, that's a very strong exclusion. Okay, so this social problem, how can we, what ways have we seen this framed in the data? We see one might want to reduce the harm done, right? Abusive interactions, they're unpleasant to be on the other end of, and they're unpleasant to observe. I think anyone who's spent some time annotating this data will probably tell you that it doesn't lift up their day particularly much. And indeed, I mean, we've also seen that lawsuit where Facebook paid $52 million, I think, $52 million in compensation to their moderators who had PTSD from observing this kind of behavior. So both observer and target are affected. And this can have long-term consequences, right? People might choose not to go outside if they are going to be, if they feel they're going to be discriminated against in an unpleasant way. Yeah. We also, I mean, we have this legal motivation. There are laws against online abuse in, for example, the EU, in China, in the UK. And we see in some countries, some of the larger platforms will review most of the flagged content within 24 hours. And in fact, there's EU monitoring of this and the performance of the platforms like this, and they do an okay job in some countries, but there's a lot of variety. And I think maybe it's not impossible to correlate this with revenue and return and investment in different countries, right? Is there going to be a legal and a financial argument for moderation? And it's exhausting, right? We have those moderators with PTSD. Okay, I think really the core problem we'd like to address, though, right, would be improving the health of conversations and of communities. We need vibrant communities, or at least functional communities, right, where there's a functional discourse. And the norms for each of those communities are going to vary massively, right? Some communities, like 4chan, probably would prefer to allow as much harmful content present as they like. Things like Mumsnet in the UK or Slumban in Denmark, in these cases, there could be slightly tighter restrictions in order for a community to feel that it was able to communicate constructively. And when those communities can't communicate constructively, then we have a damaged civic discourse, right? And we have individuals having a bad time, which, I mean, you can cry a river about this and make it into a smaller example, but impact item, but really it's very unnecessary harm that's being caused, right? And so I think it's perfectly reasonable to ask people, for people to have functioning discourses in their communities. And of course, this also damages revenue, right? So if you don't care about any of the other stuff, then the bottom line is also affected. If people don't participate, they're probably not going to be clicking ads. They won't be generating free content for platforms. Okay, so how are we going to define the tasks that we're working with, right? This is our big AI problem where we're trying to take the qualitative into the quantitative. We're trying to address very human problems and intrinsically human behaviors using computational methods and relatively new technology. But a lot of the existing research we have uses quite ad hoc definitions. Those can be problematic. For example, here you see a picture of the Gimli glider, an aeroplane that was filled up and measured in kilograms of fuel, I think, as far as I recall, where the figure was given in US gallons, which of course in fact are different from the international standard gallon and the imperial gallon. So now I have to kind of consider, when I see these units, just as the mile is different, when people say there's imperial units, one has to consider which empire. But I get off track. So for this anyway, right, the problem is that we're breaking how well we can share data and how valid our results are, right? How replicable they are. Maybe someone has a definition that's very easy to annotate and very easy for a machine to detect, perhaps because it uses keywords and phrases described in a legal standard. And that will make their offensive language detection system have an over-reported performance. So how can we address this? Maybe then it makes more sense to reflect a little bit on our detection tasks, right? How we define this annotation. And rather than come up with a single unified answer to this, I think it's naive, of course, to think that there is a single unified answer to this. It's always quite application specific. And as we've discussed, there are many forms that abuse can take, right? But there are some dimensions one should really consider when planning a data set, when planning an activity. For example, who is targeted? Are we looking at maybe repeated abusive events towards individuals, right? i.e. harassment or bullying? Or are we looking at slurs made against groups, perhaps based on identity, right? So things like sexism, misogyny, or racism, or transphobia. Then are we looking at the strength of the content? We consider this, right? We should think, are we looking for very overt examples where someone is overtly kind of using quite direct words? Or perhaps we're looking at the different strength where there's something a little subtler going on, and this is rather something we'd rather report and learn about the prevalence of, rather than even consider filtering or moderating. Then there's the nature of the abuse, right? What kind of actual subphenomenon are we dealing with? What does our taxonomy look like for this particular task, right? What kinds of things are we expecting? Then also we're interested in how abuse manifests. Is it going to be turning up as threats? Will it be turning up as derogatory statements? Will people be constructing a narrative using profanities, for example? And then we have the tone, right? People can also just have quite a calm, jolly debate with a bit of jolly bit of sexist jokes and that kind of thing, which of course could be quite problematic to people who are interested in detecting those phenomena, or maybe concerned about participating in that community, but certainly would probably be, certainly would be non-aggressive in the intended context. So to pile that kind of thing in with very aggressive sexist speech is quite misrepresentative and makes for a kind of a misconstrued detection task. Maybe there's a specific target, right? Is it an identity aspect, for example, like the ones we see here? And then finally, what's the perception here, right? We've seen there's some tasks out there where there's a specific data set considering whether or not something is respectful, for example, and this is an attribute people have also annotated. So we should consider how granular then we're going to make the labels. I think I've argued a bit so far for there being many different labels here, and I'll carry on pushing that. How granular do we make the labels, right? Are we going to do a binary classification? This can be vague, it can be really hard to annotate, and the data can be hard to reuse. If there's only just a kind of a top level category, and we're only annotating member or not, there's no nuance, there's no further data, there's no further explanation. So it can be a little tricky to use this data for another task. Much more helpful if there's more explanation. So maybe we might consider instead making the labels based on a single kind of abuse, right? Is this person directed? Is this group directed? And that again is useful. It starts to tell us a little bit more about what's going on. But it comes with a risk of being uninformative, right? So abuse we often see is kind of directed, but it's usually versus a group rather than multiple groups. And so in this case, instead of providing, if you like, the abstract class, right, group directed, it can be much more useful to provide a concrete example of which group is affected. So in this case, we might have some detection tasks, like we talk about a single group, perhaps politicians, perhaps against Muslims. Another option we would see, maybe we can allow multiple annotation. I think when you start looking at this data, it's unsurprising to discover that some of the some abusive content can have multiple kinds of abuse, right? We might find racist and sexist content all mixed together to different strengths as well, right? So I saw, for example, this morning there was a web forum where people were calling feminists and feminism a direct, in kind of a direct expression of fascism and Nazism, and then they end with this comment like, get all of identity X out of the country. So we see multiple things going on here. Alright, so that's what we would label with. The next question then is, what are we going to label, right? Different phenomena happen at different levels. Offensive content can happen at a post. it's a single post, whereas harassment generally has both a legal and, in our terms, also when we annotate, a kind of more pragmatic requirement that it has to be a sequence of events, multiple events, for something to be harassment. So you can't identify or annotate harassment based on one individual message. Disruptive behavior, it might be easier, well, it makes sense to determine if a user has disruptive tendencies, or at least writes disruptive things frequently, only if you look at that user's profile, right, instead of a small sample of their posts. And also we see that over the data we have, the modality of the data can vary a lot. So we'll see there could be text, plain text, versus text in memes. I know there's an interesting shared task coming up and running about this at the moment, actually. And then also we might like to think about the context of images. So in this case, we can see we have a spectrogram, and someone's found a particular noise, and they found that if they record this noise, it's a little creative, if they record this noise, they can draw a picture of a penis using a spectrogram on another person's phone, right? So in some contexts that could be jovial, in others directly offensive, and maybe even harassment. But the use of modality is really present. All right. What language should we be doing data in? I think this. Which language should you go and collect data in for your next study? I think we have a lot of English data sets, right? Do we need even any more general purpose English data sets? I'm a little skeptical about this, whereas for specific tasks it now makes sense. We have an okay grasp of generally how English looks, especially on Twitter and especially over the past few years. But there are many major languages where we're missing big, openly accessible data sets, right? Here's a list. Each of these have tens to hundreds of millions of speakers, even thousands, and we don't have big data sets so we can go and mine and find out what is going on. And in fact, some whole language families are missing any data at all. Also, we have to be aware that there's more than a language code thing going on here, right? If we just go and filter by language code, maybe we don't get the whole picture. If, for example, when we get the text, we don't get the visual channel, we don't get the audio channel. Looking for abusive content on TikTok, for example, that's tricky, right? That's definitely, you can have text over the TikToks, you have the video itself, and then also edits on the audio stream. So there's a filter on the audio stream. So you have many things happening here. Yeah. And then also we'll see that the style of language changes from platform to platform. The way people express themselves in a blog will be different from how they express themselves on Twitter. And many genres and domains of language are poorly represented in the data we see. Okay, so if you're going to go and build this data set and do the study, an important thing to also do is find an online space that you'd like to study. Each online space will have different norms and different biases, right? So we know platform design affects how people interact. Instagram has this default very high positivity and even very slightly negative comments, maybe even the absence of emojis could be construed as negative, and it could be how an attack presents as well. Whereas tweets, these kind of require a snappy composition. There's a tendency for people to go for things that grab attention, and you don't get many characters to do this in, right? I don't think many people will even bother with reading all of the full 280 characters if one says so much. Yeah, so this pushes out moderating words like hedges in the sentences and requires quite sharp content. So you can imagine the interactions there are very different from those we see on Instagram. So just to reiterate, the two impacts here are different platforms have different norms and different baseline levels, and the cross-platform transfer of models, data, assumptions, and behavior is very unlikely to work. Indeed, this stuff is, in the example, in the abusive example here, is all from from a game chat. And here we can see this. Some of these people are quite good friends. In fact, when one looks at the broader context, others are newcomers to the game. And there's some L2 going on here. There's novel orthography. And definitely, if you want to find some abusive examples, you can find them here. Okay. So these platforms have different demographics, right? Dota 2, Abusive, and abuse is all there and it's rampant. And it's a really nice example of this kind of low-level, non-serious, low-intensity, non-serious abuse that men are often the objects of, right? There's a lot of it, and it's low intensity, and it's generally not serious. Whereas we compare it to the abuse that women receive, which is slightly less, but with much higher intensity, right? This will start going into threats of violence and death before long. Twitter, if we look at Twitter as an online space, we're missing some nations. China has a local alternative. Germany doesn't really tweet so much, or at least has a very biased demographic of Twitterers. And then also we find disjoint groups, right? So British Twitter is very connected, even though they're all speaking in English. They don't connect nearly as much as the groups found in US Twitter. Black Twitter, again, can form quite disjoint networks from other groups on Twitter. Yeah. Then the age of the members also affects the level of engagement and the kind of engagement. So you can, to put this in more human terms, even the platform that the many different people are using shapes their interactions, shapes the norms of that community. So you have to be really careful what you study. And it's very unlikely that these norms are going to transfer from platform to platform or work globally. How much data do we find in data sets out there? We see somewhere between relatively small data sets, 500 posts, to tens of millions. So one thing to consider in this case is how the data will be annotated, right? 17 million posts might take a bit too much money to annotate with the same rigor that a smaller data set could be processed with. So the next question that emerges from this is, okay, well, how much data do I need to generalize? And we see that if we start subsampling from our data sets, then we can get these nasty drops in F1, right? Especially with deep learning. If we have a very small data set, we're very unlikely to get good performance, and we're extremely unlikely to get a classifier that generalizes in any useful way. And we're quite unlikely to get that in the first place, right? Unless we're looking at quite a relatively pinned down phenomena. On the other hand, big data sets mean that we're going to have slow training, and we need to be quite careful about the sampling methodology, right? Because we don't want to be confined to one narrow period of time, especially if this is just a few hours. Then you really also have a spatial, right, a geographical constraint based on where people are awake and active at that time. Because there's so much data, maybe it makes a lot of sense to only do active learning. There's a data set, kind of the Dynabench contrastive learning environment has produced some very interesting data on this. Although whether or not contrastively developed data sets will generalize, or if they'll just help a model get a high score, remains an open question. I think we might need a bit more there. But if we really want to, on the other hand, it's so important to annotate the data that your model doesn't do well with, right? If we keep seeing the same kinds of representations of abuse, this isn't worth spending annotator time on after a point. How about class distribution, huh? That's a tricky one. Skewed data will tend to produce a skewed classifier, and the classifier will probably amplify that skew. And we know the data is thankfully heavily skewed to non-abusive, right? Most people, most people aren't abusive all the time. This means it's costly to find each abusive instance. To get around this, people often use purposive sampling, for example, keyword-based sampling. But this really decreases the capture of terms not in a lexicon, right? The least you could do with this is take maybe 1 million words, run some Brown clustering, and then find the other cluster terms around the lexicon terms. Another solution one sees very often is to add some randomly sampled data, just to make sure one isn't overfit to that lexicon. In fact, there are some extra risks, right, to using a lexicon to sample. It can distort the politics of abuse. Here's a short little story. Terms used by the far right are very well represented in these data sets, right? For example, racist, pejoratives. This means that far right-wing comments will be very present in the data. So if we take something like a BERT and train them over this data, we'll find that these lexica derived terms create a lot of high presence and overrepresentation of texts espousing right-wing opinions. And so now we'll see that people putting out right-wing ideas are more likely to be labelled as abusive. And so we have a misperforming classifier that excludes people from the discourse and damages trust in moderation, and so ends up creating more polarization and an angrier debate than we had before. This actually ends up kind of marginalizing our entire area of application. So I think that's a pretty serious point to take into account. And I hope you will consider or reconsider use of lexicons very seriously. Okay, another thing to think about, who wrote this, right? Who's the identity? Who built the content? The demographic of the author is some really important context, right? It will tell us if there's in-group terminology. Are they discussing abuse aimed at them, right? Are they just quoting something that they've received, or are they actually expressing it outwardly? And we'll see in some data sets we can find many abusive posts. I'm sure you've seen this if you've discussed the topic online, right? You might find that there are some people, a small group of authors, who will get into these topics and put out a lot of abusive context. Will this generalize? You know, right? So this, I think, was a really nice finding from the WOAH' and Hovey data from 2016. Fantastic, go and drill into this and we discover this new bias. So that was such a valuable data set and exercise to have. How about dog whistles, though? Right? How about this kind of stuff in the data? So we know who wrote the data, we've chosen what we're looking for, and we've chosen where we're going to look for it. But who's going to annotate it? Abuse requires expert eyes. Here's an example where some people this guy who was fired from the BBC for bad behaviour was using a racist term that also could be a technical building term to describe a person on a bridge. And if you don't know the term, you won't see what's happening, so you can't do the annotation. So we need people who know those signals, right? We need experts who can annotate these things. They won't be recognized by a broad group. So if you know who the target group is for what you're trying to annotate, they will be your best annotators. For example, men are less likely to see or observe or recognize all forms of or all instances of misogyny. There can be some misinterpretation, there can be different ideas about how much has to be demonstrated. Why is this bad? Well, we don't want to train a model that replicates something that already is missing abuse, right? If you have annotators that miss abuse, they make a data set, and then the data set trains a model, that model will also miss that abuse. So this means some annotators actually present risks, right? That's really what I'm saying here. Which annotators are they that present risks? Crowdsourced annotators present a risk. They're not necessarily as diligent. However, one of the massive boons of crowdsourced annotators is they have huge diversity as long as you control your job to make sure you get that diversity, right? For example, limit the number of annotations an individual worker can perform. You don't want one person doing 90% of the annotations for a data set, for example. Then you're not really getting the high diversity you want. To really limit the number of annotations, get many different crowd workers, they'll pick out interesting things. So we often observe from this they will have low agreement, right? Crowd annotated data will have low inter-annotator agreement, but quite high recall if we consider that recall is if any worker identified a piece of abuse. Most pieces of abuse will be identified. This means inter-annotator agreement won't work as a metric, right? But on the other hand, we want recall, right? We don't want to train a classifier that misses things. We want to train a classifier that finds things. And we're not worried about this because we're only ever using it with a human in the loop, right? Which other annotators present risks? Well, that's people like me, probably like many of you as well, academics, researchers. Very diligent people, of course, quite well read, absolutely, yeah. All those other wonderful things that we are, attends top workshops. And this will mean that we'll have a lot of homophily, right? We'll have a lot of common interests, we'll have high proficiency in many of those common interests, and so we're likely to all have very high agreement, given any set of annotation standards. However, because we share so much in common, we often have low recall. So what we can see here actually is from named entity recognition over some social media data which contained a ton of different concepts, we found that the recall among experts was low, but they agreed a lot with each other. So they all agree about the small corner they can annotate, whereas the crowd, they find everything, but they disagree. And that's fine, right? Different people have different bits of knowledge, and that all complements each other. So once we have our people to do the annotation and we know what the task is, then what next, right? How do we do our abusive language annotation? 5 steps, right? You need a diverse group of annotators. Don't find only people who seem in the target group, right? Find also a couple of people who might understand what's going on but aren't in the target group. They'll learn something, perhaps, and they'll bring other knowledge, right? They'll increase the diversity of knowledge in that group. Have regular group discussions. We did this for a recent exercise where the groups would meet weekly, and there'd be a discussion, especially of all the disagreements. And one thing we did for this discussion, number 3, is have a moderator in the discussions. The moderator is the person who can recognize who talks a lot, who doesn't talk so much, and correct for that bias, right? Make sure the discussion doesn't go one way too far, but also make sure that the points that are made quietly or made once or made at the end of the session still contain the appropriate amount of weight. If you can't agree on something in your group, put the edge case aside. You'll get more experience as you continue to annotate and continue to develop the codebook, the guidelines. So put the edge cases aside. Don't try and make a firm decision on those yet. Come back to them later when there's more expertise available. And then finally, maintain a living document of what's been done, how the task is defined, and how the task is implemented. Keep that codebook. This is the manual, this is the definition. In fact, this is the externalized cognition of the group, right? That's such a vital tool. Okay, so how do we choose our annotator identities? Many of the data sets don't really say who did the annotation, right? Many of the descriptions of data don't name this. So the only safe thing to do is assume this data is, that a lot of phenomena, that a lot of things in the data are missing. Volunteering the information, this has to be optional, but it's good to know things like the age, the gender, the ethnicity of the crowd work. Oh, sorry, not the crowd workers, but the annotators. Maybe they're crowd, maybe not. And it's also nice to know their expertise, their experience, what kinds of academic background maybe they have, what vocational knowledge they have. Maybe there's something in their background. We had someone who was a film producer but have produced films about refugees, right? So this that tells you a little bit more about what they might know. And then personal experiences of abuse. People who've been on the receiving end of this have that knowledge. Maybe they won't want to go through it again, but maybe they're happy to deal with this kind of material again and help out with an annotation task. So this can affect their perceptions of what's happening in multiple ways. So it's just really important to be aware of that. And you'll definitely have that, I think, probably turn out to be an extremely valuable asset. All right, now we have annotations, let's say that. Well, we kind of had our annotations, but we'd like to get good quality ones, right? Like gold data. Get good annotations. How do you do this? You have to train your annotators. Best practices for crowdsourcing, of course, you have an annotation kind of qualification run, right? And the same goes with non-crowd annotation. You have to train annotators. As an NLP researcher, I think probably the best way of getting to know data, the most valuable exercise you can ever do, I think, in NLP is go and look at the data for like an hour, hour and a half. Just take out the file, go through it, close the other windows, concentrate on this. Maybe try and do some of your own labeling on it. You will get to know the data super well, super quick, and that will be very valuable. We found in a lot of research that annotation guidelines, however, are kept private. Only like a quarter of papers give a summary of what they were, and only a seventh of papers, authors were also able to provide the guidelines verbatim. I think this while it makes it hard to work out exactly what the annotations mean across data sets, also when one is receiving, kind of being attacked for publishing on this kind of work, which can happen unfortunately, feeding people what's in the guidelines only prolongs that event. So I can understand why some might be reluctant to provide them. Unfortunately, having no guidelines or very brief guidelines means the annotator can be extremely subjective, which increases the variance and the bias. All right, what about our risks to annotation? Well, irony, humans have a bit of difficulty dealing with this, right? Prevalent, maybe a ninth to a third of instances. And if humans can't do it, we can't really expect machines to do it very much either. Another risk to annotation, deceit, right? This is things like false statements, slander, libel, calumniation, right? We have to ask, is false information abusive if it's slandering? But if it turns out to be true, is it now less abusive? I think there's a really interesting question there. Also, is the speaker is it slander? Is a negative? Is like an insult? Is it necessarily slander if the speaker believes it? Right? If in good faith they believe it, is it slander? Legally, possibly it could be, but in terms of annotation, I don't know. That's a tricky one to deal with. So we could probably say it's abusive, but beyond that, difficult. Huge risk to annotation, I think, in all NLP really is intent. Like, what is the utterable state of mind? What are they getting at? What are they intending? And with written text, this is just hard. This is just hard. There's this wall of intent, and you can't see over the other side of it. So it's generally unknowable. But it is kind of required for some detections. For example, if there's an intent to assert power, one needs to find a test for this to annotate this subtype of misogynistic dominance. Then if there's high-grade trolling, it might be very clean on the surface, but it could intentionally also be kind of offensive through polygamy and so on. How about annotator disagreement? Sorry for the lot of text, but you can all see near the endpoint. So, well, when you have many annotators, you're going to get some disagreement. That's okay, right? Because agreement doesn't mean correctness. High annotator agreement doesn't mean that the data is correct. There could just be a subset of people who are able to identify a phenomenon, and the people who've said there's nothing there are incorrect, even if they're the majority. So the important thing is to discuss those disagreements, amend the codebook, maybe send the example back and annotate it later. One problem we see here, I think, is Fleiss's scale is subjective. Here's an explanation given to the Kappas in the late 70s. And what is the difference between fair and moderate, right? Between 0.2 and 0.6. And then if we have 0.6 to if we have a kappa of below 0.6, do we now have insubstantial agreement? I think these are rough. A bit more, there's kind of a research lacuna around this, how you interpret a kappa score. And I'd love to see some work on that in this area. Fine. And then how about data sharing? So these results that we've looked at today, we've looked all the way from the language and platform of the results through to the quality of the annotations. These only come right from openly available data. And we have this bit of a tension where we want to protect personal data, but we need to have good scientific integrity. We need some infrastructure then for sharing this. A couple of requirements. We need to have a good amount of data sets. Good amount of data. We need high quality data. We need data that represents classes in a useful distribution. And we need data that is simple enough to access legally, at least for researchers. One solution to this is the idea of a data trust, where the data is placed with an organization who moderates control to this. And that's a kind of a framework for quality assurance for sharing data and for monitoring the data. We also have hatespeechdata.com, which is just on the cusp of a revamp. The beta's there, and there's one invoice, and I'm really looking forward to launching the new version as a CCAN instance, where you can submit your data sets and share them. There's about 40, 50 data sets up there already, and that's only going to get better. Okay, just to round up the talk then, thank you for making it this far. Best practices then in abusive language data. Okay, so how do we form our abusive language tasks? We should define the problem first, right? What phenomena are being captured? Why are they being captured? And what taxonomy will capture this well? Currently, there's a lot of variation. We need to pin this down. And also we need to be aware that general purpose abusive language data is now unlikely to advance our field. What data do we choose? We can't do this ad hoc, right? So we need to describe which language will be annotated, where the data will be sampled from, how the sampling will be completed. And this needs to, I just taken the points brought up earlier in the talk for this. Be careful with keyword-based sampling, for example. Consider different times, different places, different platforms. Now you have your data. Now you need to annotate that abusive language. So you need to train people so they can capture the abusive items in there. Right? Find people who have experience of the phenomena that you're searching for. Read into the social literature. Get a grounded, socially, kind of a socio-psychological grounding for what you're looking at. And remember that guideline quality and data quality are pretty much inextricably linked. There's this old saying where we say a low IAA means unclear guidelines. I think you can have good guidelines and still get a low IAA, but if you have bad guidelines, you're definitely going to get a low or meaningless IAA. So you need those guidelines. Iterate over the guidelines, upgrade them, look at other people's guidelines. This will become a great document in and of itself. Then build your data set to last, right? Document what's annotated, who said it, who annotated it. Really simple way, fill out a data statement for NLP. It's a nice template, reflect over it. There's a new version come out earlier this year. Think about how the phenomena are defined, right? And the documentation means that other people can understand your work, make it maybe compatible with their research, and this gives longevity to all the effort you've put in. So here's the best practice cheat sheet, right? Design the dataset to address relevant questions, explore some new sources. I hope we see many interesting new sources throughout the workshop. Remember the size of a dataset is defined by getting that positive data in there, right? Use a theoretically sound description and taxonomy, give your guidelines, get people in who've experienced what's happening, and then report on it all with a data statement. Very simple, right? Okay, thank you very much. And thanks also to Bertie, my co-author, for a lot of this work, to Feline, and also to everyone who's dealt with this data and the audience who create it.